if you have your Bible, you can flip open. We're going to be reading out of Jonah 2. If you're reading out of the Bible in front of you in the pew there, it is page 754. Yes, Bronwyn, it is. And if you don't have a Bible, that is our gift to you. Feel free to take that one home with you. And without further ado, Hannah.
So as I said, page 754. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress, I called the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help. And you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depth, into the very heart of the seas, and the current swelled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The angle-filled waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains, I sank down. The earth beneath buried me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I will shout for grateful praise and will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. This is the word of the Lord.
One of my favorite things to do is to sit down with somebody over a cup of coffee, as someone who's skeptical or wrestling with what their faith looks like. Or maybe they don't have faith, but they're curious, and one thing led to another, that they're asking questions, they're exploring, what does this whole thing around Jesus look like? I think I love having these type of questions because naturally I'm skeptical. I don't know if it's because I'm a millennial or it's just the way I'm built. I don't know. But my journey through faith and how I got here was one through questions and skepticism. I love having these questions because I have found that the church hasn't always been a place that's created space for people to explore their doubts and seeing the importance of doubt. So naturally, in my role, I have many of these kind of conversations with people all the time, sometimes planned, sometimes not planned. Sometimes they're short conversations, sometimes they're long. Sometimes I'm just trying to get a pepper and some milk and some eggs at the grocery store, and then inevitably what I do, and then all their whole questions around Christianity come up as I'm trying to pay. But other times their conversations are longer, and people reach out, want to have a cup of coffee, and discuss some things. I remember one time sitting down with an individual, and they were wrestling with stuff, and they were quite skeptical and would in no way affiliate with Jesus. In fact, they didn't believe in Jesus. Not that they didn't believe in following Jesus, they didn't believe Jesus even existed. And they believed this because they believed the Bible was clearly mythical, that it wasn't accurate at all. And the reason why they didn't believe the Bible was accurate is they gave me their watertight argument. It's like, how could the Bible be true, Jordan? For goodness sakes, there's a man who gets swallowed by a whale in it. Clearly this book is mythical and we can't trust it. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. For many of us, we can't hear the significance of the story of Jonah because we get stuck on this line. Most people know the story of Jonah inside and outside of church because of this line, because this is the man who was swallowed by a whale or a fish. So far, this story has been somewhat of a normal ancient story, full of all kinds of irony, but we can't swallow the idea that Jonah was swallowed by what they say is a huge fish. In Hebrew, huge fish literally means huge fish. We're actually not quite sure exactly what the writer is referring to, but many scholars believe this is probably a whale. But many people draw a circle around this and this story of Jonah and say this is why we can't believe the Bible. This is why the Bible is full of myth and it's just simply fiction. As a result of this modern day skepticism, many Bible defenders have gone to task to make sense of what's happening here. What's happening to Jonah's life? How do we make sense of this and show that the Bible is true? So there's many different arguments that have come forth. One defense is that the story is simply a hyperbole. That when, the writer's speaking about Jonah being swallowed by a huge fish, that's just an imagery for Jonah's rock bottom moment. The problem with this view is that the text doesn't seem to read like a hyperbole. It seems to read like a historical text, like other narratives we find in the Bible that are historical. Another explanation would be that one commentator suggests that the great fish is actually a name for an inn that's outside of Nineveh. True story. And they said, hey, this was just an inn that Jonah went called the Great Fish. It's a great name for an inn, by the way. And after a wild 3 days and 3 nights of Jonah having a good old time, he has no more money, and he gets kicked out or gets vomited out of this inn. Finally, others have researched, and they've gone to find actual cases of whales swallowing different things. And they reported that they've, have evidence of whales swallowing horses and all kinds of other things. And even on one occasion in the late 19th century, there was this man that was trying to harpoon a whale, and the whale didn't like that very much. And so the whale swallowed this man. Later, his friends captured this whale, and they were cutting up the whale, and they found in that whale that man, unconscious but yet alive. And I don't know about you, but for me and my different Facebook feeds, I see different Christians posting articles titled, "Man Found Alive After Living 1 Week in a Whale." And all these arguments that we make around Jonah misses the point. See, the reality is when many individuals are questioning the type of genre in which Jonah is, whether it's mythical or historical, they're making a more grandeur philosophical statement. And that is that miracles are not possible. It's not the specifics about whether Jonah was swallowed by the whale are not important. They're making a larger statement here that miracles, they just don't happen, Jordan. We're a scientific generation. We know how these things work, and people don't get swallowed by whales. Chris Price, who's a writer and a pastor here in Vancouver, he responds to this, and he says this, quote, "If you believe the first verse of the Bible, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, well, then you can believe every verse you read afterwards. In other words, if God exists, miracles are possible. If God can create an entire universe from nothing, this same God can turn water into wine, give sight to the blind, raise the dead, and allow a rebellious prophet to survive for 3 days in the belly of a great fish." Interestingly, though, the author of Jonah doesn't see this point of the fish to be the main thrust of the story. In fact, Jonah is most famous for being swallowed by a whale, but only 2 verses in the entire story even mention that so-called whale. It seems to be a small detail for the writer that wasn't part of the main larger narrative. It wasn't the main focus of what the writer wants you to see in the story of Jonah. George Adam Smith says it convincingly. He says this is the great tragedy of the book of Jonah. That a book like Jonah, which is made the means of one of the most sublime revelations of truth in the Old Testament, should be known to mostly only be connected with a whale. In other words, the whale is a distraction from the greater point that the book is trying to communicate to us. See, there is a greater, richer point that is found in the story of Jonah. There's a greater story that comes out and that happens in the belly of the whale. And this truth is illuminated to us in Jonah's little prayer here, this little poem that Hannah just beautifully read for us. In this poem, Jonah reveals to us what I would call mercy at the bottom. Mercy at the bottom seems to be the thrust, the main idea in which Jonah wants to communicate to us. And the whale just seems to be one of the pieces to us hearing that story. That's the big idea today. We're going to unpack that idea of mercy at the bottom, and we're going to look at two reasons why we seem to find mercy at the bottom of life. But a quick recap for those of you that are new or haven't been here for a few weeks. We're going through this ancient story of Jonah found in the Hebrew Bible. Jonah was an 8th century BC prophet. He was from Israel, and God gave him a call to go to a place called Nineveh. Nineveh were their arch enemies. Nineveh did terrible things. And so he didn't want to go to Nineveh, so he went to a place called Tarshish. God sent a storm on the boat that he was a part of. The sailors determined that he's the source of the storm, and just to survive and get through that, they threw him overboard. Chapter 1 finishes with a whale coming and swallowing Jonah. Again, a whale that the Lord sent to swallow Jonah. And then chapter 2, the entire chapter is Jonah's prayer to God while in this fish. There's a common theme in Jonah's life up to this point, if you've been following along. And the common word for Jonah is down. Jonah left where his village and he went down to Joppa to get on a boat. And while he was on that boat, it went down to Tarshish. And while he was traveling on that boat, he went down to the lower deck to sleep. And then while the storm came, they threw him off, and the whale swallowed him, and the whale took him down to the depths of the ocean. This could just be coincidence, but I think the writer is trying to tell us a theme about Jonah's life here. They're trying to illustrate to us that his life is full of failure after another. His life is a constant going down. Even this prayer, this psalm, kind of encapsulates the theme of Jonah's life. It starts off with Jonah being in the belly of the fish. I can't think of worse places to be. Personally, I've never been there, because I would write a Facebook post for you all to read about my experiences. But even on the right, Jonah says from the deep in the realm of the dead. That's how he's describing his context, his situation. In fact, that word there, the Hebrew word is Sheol, which is a large word that has lots of meaning, more meaning beyond what we have time for today, but simply means from the dead or the grave. The New Testament translates it as hell. This is how Jonah is describing his situation. It is fair to say that Jonah is in his rock bottom moment. But this moment, Jonah's rock bottom, this moment seems to transform him. See, he has experienced many setbacks in his life. We've read about many of them up to this point, but this moment seemed to be different for him. This moment seemed to transform and seemed to change him. It's here in his rock bottom moment in the belly of the fish that he seems to grow a deeper perspective of life. See, something happened to Jonah. Something changed in him. Something that happened to him that didn't happen before, and it happened in his rock bottom moment. Timothy Keller, his perspective on this, he says, the way up was first of all down. In other words, the way up for Jonah was first of all, he had to go down, that something happened to have there. And Keller goes on, he says, the usual place to learn greatest secrets of God's grace is at the bottom. There's mercy at the bottom. Charles Colson worked in the White House for President Richard Nixon in the late 1960s. If you're unaware of who Richard Nixon is, well, he's the only president in U.S. history who resigned from office. This was all due to many different factors, but mostly around a controversy around something called Watergate. If you're not sure what Watergate is, you should watch a Netflix documentary or talk to somebody over 60, they likely would know. Anyways, story for another day. But Charles, or Chuck as his friends called him, he got caught up in all of this because he was close ties with Richard Nixon. And because of this, he was facing almost certain jail time. But Colson was in a season of his life because of his successful as being a lawyer who could fix problems. He had received this respectful pedigree. He had the best job. He was making more money than he ever did. He had clients lining up wanting for him to use his services because he was known as the fixer. But now, in almost a moment, he was caught up with all this controversy and his reputation was out the door and he was seen as crooked. His kids were being bullied at school because of it. Many of his friends that would follow him and be a part of his life were now abandoning him and wanting nothing to do with him. Nobody wanted to take on his case. All of this came together to make one of the hardest seasons of his life. In his autobiography titled Born Again, he tells a story while in the midst of it, he goes to visit a friend called Tom. He goes to talk to Tom and he tells him about his realities and they brainstorm about different solutions with everyone seeming worse than the one before that. And around partway through the conversation, Tom brought up the subject of Jesus. Chuck was a bit skeptical of this. He knew his whole world was crashing around him, and he didn't just want to turn to religion in this moment as just desperation plea. Tom didn't push the subject, but he did offer to pray for Chuck. This again startled Chuck and removed him from his thought process because Chuck has never prayed with anyone before. He's done grace a few times in life, but this is the first time anyone has prayed for him, and he's not sure what to say or how to respond, but he obliges and accepts. After his meeting, he goes out and he sits in the darkness of the driveway in his car, and this is what he says. Outside, in the darkness, the iron grip I'd kept on my emotions began to relax. Tears welled up in my eyes as I groped in the darkness for the right key to start my car. Angrily, I brushed them away and started the engine. I said, "What kind of weakness is this?" I said to nobody. As I drove out of Tom's driveway, the tears were flowing uncontrollably. There was no street lights, no moonlight. The car headlights were flooding illumination before my eyes, but I was crying so hard it was like trying to swim under water. I pulled to the side of the road, not more than 100 yards from the entrance to Tom's driveway, the tires sinking into soft mounds of pine needles. With my face cupped in my hands, with my head leaning forward against the wheel, I forgot about machoism, about pretenses, about fears of being weak. And as I did, I began to experience a wonderful feeling of being released. Then came this strange sensation that water was not only running down my cheeks, but surging through my whole body as well, cleansing and cooling it as it went. They weren't tears of remorse or sadness, nor of joy, but somehow they were tears of relief. And then I prayed, my first real prayer. God, I don't know how to find you, but I'm going to try. I'm not much the way I am now, but somehow I want to give myself to you. I didn't know how to say more, or so I repeated over and over the words, "Take me, take me." It is in the lowest moments that we experience a mercy that we don't seem to experience in the other times. See, it is in the low moments of life we experience things, you and I. They teach us things. We see things that were never clear on the mountain. Although they might have always been present, we see them most clearly in the valley. And the story of Jonah makes it profoundly clear. Jonah was exposed to himself. Everything was stripped from him. But more importantly, Jonah in his rock bottom moment in the belly of the fish is where he saw God differently. It was only at the bottom that he experienced a love and a mercy that he had forgotten or never felt he needed. There is mercy at the bottom. But was God's mercy always there? Wasn't God's mercy always present? What changed? Or in other words, what does the bottom produce in us to see God's love more clearly that the other seasons of life doesn't? Why is it that we often experience mercy at the bottom? Well, Jonah's little poem here, his prayers, gives us several reasons why, but let me draw your attention to two reasons why I think mercy is so prominent at the bottom. First, we learn our limitations. As you read this poem of Jonah, you see a man who understands the gravity of the situation. You read of someone who understands how his actions have brought him to this point. The current swirled around me. Seaweed wrapped around my head. I don't see anybody putting that on their bumper. The engulfing waters, they threaten me. This is a man who understands the context of where he is and how he got there. David Brooks says it this way: suffering shatters. Suffering shatters the illusion of self-sufficiency. See, Jonah leaned into his ancestry, his national pride. But what confidence he had, it quickly became a hindrance for him. He thought it was because of his lineage, because even being a prophet on top of that, and that in some way that he earned God's mercy, that he was self-sufficient. And like Jonah, you can always tell when someone is functioning under the assumption that they've earned their mercy, that they are not in need of mercy. You can always understand or see someone who functions under that assumption based on how they treat others and their need for mercy. The ones who know they've received mercy are the ones who haven't. You can tell the difference between the two. Again, Keller says this: there was a fatal flaw in Jonah's character, and had laid hidden from him as long as his life was going well. It was only through complete failure that he began to see it and change it. Jonah never saw it before. He missed it. He did not see himself as the one who was in need of mercy. He missed God's mercy and grace, or he never thought he needed it in the first place. It wasn't until I got to post-secondary that I became interested in books. I never read books before that point, but once I arrived at post-secondary, I found out that books were the best ways for me to learn. And I came out here to the West to learn. That was my only priority, is I want to learn and make sense of who this Jesus person is and what does that mean for my life. And so as I surrounded myself in this Christian context at a level that I've never experienced before, everybody's got book recommendations for you. They'll say, you should read this book. Absolutely changed my life. You should read this book. It's the best book you've ever read. You should read this book. I think God himself wrote it. But one book that seemed to come up over and over again in many people's lives, and even different writings I was reading about people referencing, was a book called Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I imagine many of you have heard it or read it before. It's a little book. I like little books. Anyways, I was at school, so they gave me all these mandatory boring readings that I had to do all the time. You know, post-secondary, that's what they do. And the stuff that you actually read, you kind of have to wait for later in life. So summertime came, and I was up here still at school doing some things, and I picked out this book off the shelf, and I started to read it. I remember one night, like it was yesterday. One night, it was just a summer evening, it was after supper, and I just pulled up this book, and I was reading it. I was on a chapter called, as he titled it, The Great Sin. And the whole chapter was about pride. And then he, talks about all the problems of pride and all these things, and I don't know about you, but when I'm reading this, I'm thinking all the people that are arrogant in my life. I have so many people that are so prideful. I was like, I should photocopy this chapter and give it to them. I was like, that's probably too forward. I should just give them the whole book and be a little bit more stealth about it and say chapter 7's really good. And then Lewis says, those who hate pride in others probably have their own pride they haven't dealt with. I didn't like that chapter. I didn't like that sentence. And he goes on, he says, as long as you are proud, you cannot know God. See, my first year of post-secondary, it was a year that was stripping from me. It was a year that were many things that I had pride in, many things that I assumed, many things were taken and broken and then rebuilt and evaluated for me. And it was in this season of brokenness that there was an aspect of my character that was illuminated to me that I missed before. My own limitations became clear to me in my broken life in that season. See, I could have read this chapter of Lewis in a different season and appreciated the intellectual wit and appreciated how he crafted his words, but something about this writing and this moment seemed to hit me in a new way, and I really think that it was because of all of the brokenness that led me up to that moment. David Benner writes this great little book called The Gift of Being Yourself, another little book, it's great. And Don Pennington writes a foreword for it, and I think Don Pennington's foreword, he has this little two-sentence here that I think really encapsulates this idea. This is what he says. If I were sinless, if I had no brokenness in my life, if I had no limitations, if I had no flaws, if I were sinless, the perfect image of God, I could know the God of love. I could know the God of love. But knowing myself as a sinner, knowing myself as someone that has limitations, someone that messes up, someone with brokenness, someone with setbacks, someone as a sinner enables me to know something more, enables me to know a God of mercy, something greater. For love responds to what is good and lovable, but mercy responds to what is not good, and it makes it good and lovable, the gift of being myself. It's in our limitations that we realize the mercy that we desperately need. You realize that there's a love that was always there despite of your brokenness. Secondly, we learn who's Savior. Jonah kind of finishes his whole poem saying this in verse 8, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. The language of Jonah is very honest. It's heartfelt. It's a heartfelt poem that describes a God that has actually been consistent to him throughout the different stages of life. For Jonah, he is reminded of a God who has been faithful, who has always been present. But more than that, the bottom seems to demonstrate who can save us. The bottom demonstrates who can actually save us. See, Jonah starts this whole thing. He says, those who cling to worthless idols. Now, of course, Jonah is probably talking about the pantheon of gods that were present in the ancient world and how so many people did all these rituals hoping that in some way that these gods would save them. But Jonah probably was also making reference to his own idol and his idol of nationality and his pedigree and his lineage and where he comes from. But the bottom, it has a way of revealing our idols and their inability to save us. Let me just take a few moments and speak through a few common day idols for us. There's the idol of wealth. It's the security for many of us, but it never seems to be enough, does it? Maybe just me, but I think sometimes I just need some more, and sadly at the end of it, none of us can take it with us. I remember recently, just only a couple weeks, talking to someone who was in their early 20s, and I asked them, what do you want for life? Make a lot of money, that's what she said. I was like, you think that's going to bring you happiness? That's going to be most meaningful? Yeah, I see people with a lot of money and they look really happy, she says. I told her about, research is actually, a lot of data and research tells us there's a certain point of income you can make, but once you start making more than that, actually doesn't change any evaluation in your life of happiness. I think I'll be different. I just think I need to make a lot of money, and that's where my happiness is. See, many of us think we're the exception to these realities, and we try to consume and gain more wealth that we think in it will be saved by it. There's the idol of our looks. We're always fighting to be a certain size, look a certain age, have a certain attraction, to have a certain appearance, and we spend a lot of money and time to look that way. Years ago, I played in a volleyball league, and I was the only Christian on my team. They called me the chaplain. Sometimes when we were really losing, they blamed me for that because somehow I upset the gods, as they would say. But when you're playing in a kind of like a low competition league, you have a lot of time of just sitting around and chatting because there's not a lot of excitement going on the game. So I remember one time sitting on the bench with another teammate, we'll call her Nicole, and she was just looking at her phone, and her lock screen had a picture of a supermodel. I'm like, oh, who's that? And she told me who it is. I'm like, why do you have that person on your screen? She says, because it's always a reminder for me to be skinny. I thought about that, and I said, man, that sounds really hard. And without missing a beat, she's like, it's crushing, Jordan. But for her, she was hoping that if she looked a certain way, she was a certain size, that she had a certain appearance, in some way that would save her, that would bring her what she needs in life. And finally, there's the idol of our career. We've worked hard. We've worked really hard for where you are in life. We've gone to the right schools. We've made the right sacrifices. We did the interview just right. We did the right internships. We've worked really, really hard to get where we are right now. And we say things like, I deserve this promotion. I deserve this position. This is what I need. You've worked so hard. It's what you've dreamed of. It's to get to this moment. But until we are not enough, and for some reason or another we're let go, or a company goes under, or a business fails, or a family leaves us because we're just a workaholic and we're never around. None of these can save you. At some point, each idol will tell you to pay up. They always make you pay. See, the bottom is the great revealer of how much we have believed these things would save us in some way or another. But Jonah reminds us, what he can only remind us of is that salvation comes from the Lord. Jonah only could fully say that after he experienced the mercy that is found at the bottom. Jonah was at the worst place in his life. He thought certain death was almost in front of him. He thought there was no way out for him. He thought that was the end, but it was at the end that he was reminded of a God, and only that God was the one that could extend mercy to him. Years later, God will not just only send a whale to save a prophet, but he will send himself. He will send his own son to save an entire humanity. And Jesus left heaven to live among us, to live at the bottom with us. And he went all the way to Sheol. He went all the way to death itself for us to experience mercy. Are you at the bottom? Are you at the bottom? Maybe no fault of your own. Maybe one thing after another out of your control has happened, and you feel life has never been harder than it is right now. It's at the bottom that you realize the consistency in who God is. That whether you felt him or not, that he's always been with you every step of the way, that his mercy, his love, it's waiting for you in that season of life. See, only Jesus can bring us out of the pit. Only Jesus continues to be faithful in us in those seasons. That mercy is available to you today. And the beautiful thing is you don't have to articulate some great appeal for you to receive it. You don't have to make a case. You don't have to have a PowerPoint of why. You just need to invite it in. Invite Jesus in your life. You can acknowledge the reality of your life and receive the salvation that only he offers. Did you notice how Jonah started this prayer? It was very different from the rest of the book of Jonah. The whole time, Jonah almost dissociates himself from God. But listen how he starts his prayer. He prayed to the Lord, his God. See, it was after experiencing the bottom for Jonah that he is connected to his God in a new, profound way. Any follower of Jesus that goes the distance at some season or not will experience a bottom moment. And you can always tell those who have experienced mercy at the bottom because their identity with Jesus, their connection, it's deep. Like a good friend that you've journeyed with through hard times, there's a deep relationship that's formed in the bottom that isn't formed in other seasons of life. I'm inviting the Keys to come back, and I want to finish up with this one story. Amanda Cook might be a name you know. She's a Canadian, actually, grew up just outside Winnipeg. And she started to find success early in life as a singer and a songwriter. That success gave her, I think, a couple Juno nominations, but ultimately she moved to California like every gifted artist does at some point. They leave to go to California. Anyways, Justin Bieber, we'll invite you back at some point. But she goes down there to California, and she got married. She started to build a life down there, and she started to produce albums. And she came out with her first kind of single album and then broke a bunch of records. Her life was moving everywhere it was supposed to move. It was going in the right direction. Everything she dreamed of was happening until it wasn't. Her marriage ended. And this was obviously devastating for her. It was discombobulating. And it was in this season of brokenness and confusion that one of her producers said to her, I think you need to write your way through it. I think you need to sing your way through it. So she rented an old farmhouse on the top of a hill in rural Tennessee. And she goes there for several months, and she records an album titled House Upon a Hill. If you've listened to this album and the different songs of it, you know this album, there's something different about it. It's full of rawness and honesty and fragility. She says in an interview, quote, I needed to find my faith in the tactile things in front of me, she says. I wanted to return to the center. Return to the ground where faith isn't a fantasy. It was more looking out the window at the sunrise and seeing the trees and feeling grounded and wanting to write about experiencing faith in that, where faith and reality meet. Her title track on this album is called The House on a Hill, and I believe it fully captures this idea of receiving mercy at the bottom. She was full of Amanda's brokenness and pain, that she comes to this empty house in Tennessee on a hill. And it was in that house that she found God. She found something to hold on to. She found herself. This is what she writes in the song. It's quiet in this house upon a hill. You won't mind it. Some things you can't know till you're still. In the silence, let your spinning thoughts slow down. In the stillness, things have a way of working out. She continues to write, but she switches it. She writes not from her perspective, but now she writes from her Heavenly Father's perspective, speaking to her. And she says this, allow me to introduce myself again. I'm the one that knew you before time began. I've been waiting for you to let me be your friend. Everything you need is everything I am. I am. I am. I am. Take your chances. There's nothing here to lose. Ask your questions. I promise you the truth. Are you ready? I want to hear your heart. Is it heavy where wounds have left a mark? Allow me to introduce myself again. I was with you every place you've ever been. I'm the one that held you when you couldn't stand. If you're wondering who can heal your brokenness, I can. I can. I can. I'm going to invite you to stand if you're able, and the team's coming. And the prayer team is coming as well, and they would love nothing more to pray with you today, to intercede with you. Will you join me as we pray? Jesus, we just receive your mercy afresh again. Jesus, we submit, we humbly come and we request to receive your grace and your love afresh again. May we be reminded of Jonah, that your mercy has always been present and it's always been there, but maybe it's a new season for us to receive that fresh again. So Jesus, I just pray you remove any barriers. Holy Spirit, would you come? Would you minister to us? May we feel your mercy. May we experience it fresh again. Jesus, may we receive your mercy afresh.